So continuing on with Kant's critique of judgment then, last time we saw how he plugged in the aesthetical judgments into the categories of quality and quantity. In quantity it was the validity for everyone of the aesthetical judgment, and for quality it was the disinterested pleasure that we have in relation to, in our apprehension of the beautiful object, and also the distinction between the good, which involves concepts and hence not the beautiful, and the merely pleasing, the pleasant, which is pure sensation, doesn't involve concepts at all. It's merely pure sense data, and the beautiful, which is neither. It's something in between pure sensation on the one hand and pure concepts, or even empirical concepts, concepts of any kind, on the other. It's the faculty of judgment, and it's in between the categories of the understanding and the reason. And so now what he does is plug the aesthetical judgments into the categories of relation and modality. And for relation, he has an extended discussion. Relation, recall, in the critique of pure reason was the category of cause and effect, substance and cause and effect, and reciprocity. But here, the type of causality that he's concerned with is purpose, purposiveness. And he begins the chapter by making a distinction between purposiveness on the one hand and purpose on the other. And the apprehension of the beautiful has nothing to do with purpose. It has nothing to do with the representation of purpose in the object, but it does have to do with a purposiveness in the experience of the formal apprehension of the object's beauty. That is to say, its purposiveness has to do with the contemplation of the beautiful object in and for itself as a beautiful object. It has nothing to do with my interest. It doesn't arouse my relationship, my interest to it. It's not a useful object. It's not a conceptual object. It's nothing of the kind. It has a basic, it justifies its own existence, as it were. Its purposiveness is simply to be contemplated as a beautiful object. And so it can't be represented as having a purpose, which he'll get into in a second for why that is so. And so that's the distinction. It's purposiveness without purpose that is the representation of the beautiful object. And he makes a distinction between two different types of aesthetical judgments. There are empirical aesthetical judgments versus pure aesthetical judgments. And the empirical aesthetical judgments will have to do with the admixture of sensory qualities, which he calls here charms. And the charms have only to do with whether something is pleasant or unpleasant. So we're back to that pleasant category then, which has only to do with mere sensations. The apprehension of particular colors or the tones made by particular musical instruments are purely subjective and fall into the category of charms. That is to say, they're merely subjective sensations, and they have nothing to do with the apprehension of the beautiful, which has to do with the apprehension of the formal qualities of an object, not its sensory qualities, whereas the pure aesthetic judgments are precisely that, the apprehension of the purely formal aspects of an object. So an object is beautiful insofar as we apprehend its purely formal relations, that is to say, its symmetries, its sense of proportion and form and balance. This is a very classical aesthetic. And it's very similar, I think, to the old distinction in philosophy between primary and secondary qualities, actually. I think he's taken those two and translated them into these two kinds of aesthetical judgments. The secondary qualities, recall, of objects are subjective faculties, such as how something tastes, or the heat that is given off by a stove, or basic, crude, common, mundane sensory phenomena. Those are the secondary qualities which are subjective, and I think what Kant means here by charms, which are purely the subjective aspects of an object found to be beautiful, which the public often mistakes for beauty, mere charms. And the primary qualities in philosophy, which had to do precisely with the objective aspects of an object, things like motion, figure, extension, shape, solidity, and rest. That's very similar. Those are the formal properties of an object, which Kant is talking about here, that constitute the pure aesthetical judgments and which have to do with the proper relationship to the beautiful object. The mind is apprehending a beautiful form, and it's that beauty, the formal properties that constitute, even though aesthetics is by definition subjective, but that constitute its objective nature insofar as it can be said to be objective. And then so he moves on and he talks about how in the objects of sense there are also two different types, what he calls here two different types of, there's either figure or play with regard to the formal properties of objects, and play has to do with the play of figures in space, as in the case of theater or pantomime, or the play of sensations in sound, which has to do with music. And emotion is another aspect that he rules out here, and he says mere emotions, especially sentimental ones, sentimentality often gets mixed in. You find some sentimentality even in classical art, such as in Spanish, the art of the Spanish counter-reformation of the 17th century, which is very sentimental because it's part of a dying world view, and it has a sentimental, nostalgic looking back on decayed Catholic forms that it sentimentally tries to recapture, or representations of dogs and puppies and babies in art, like you find in Mary Cassatt, for example. It's sentimental and it has a kitsch value, but it's not real. It's not great art in the sense in which Kant is talking about it here. So neither charm nor emotion are part of the aesthetic sentiment of the beautiful, the apprehension of the beautiful object in and for its own sake. And he says that with regard then to objective purposiveness, so now he's dealt with sensation now. Now he's going to deal with the conceptual side. The reason why beauty on the one hand has nothing to do with the merely sensational side of phenomena, but it also does not have to do with the conceptual side. And I think this moves into a more problematic area. But he says that the conceptual side has to do with the objective, with the perception of an objective purposiveness in things. And he says that objective purposiveness in an object can be either external or internal. If it's external, then the purposiveness manifests itself in the utility of an object. It has a certain use value. That is not part of the aesthetic experience, because then that arouses the interest, and the subject's relation to the beautiful object is no longer one of disinterested contemplation in and for its own sake. But the other aspect is the internal perfection of the object, that it has a basic internal perfection to itself, which is aligned with the category of the good. That, he says, is sometimes mistaken for the beautiful by other philosophers, and he says it indeed comes closer to what he means by the beautiful. But the problem with the internal perfection, with beauty defined as a recognition of the internal perfection of an object, is that in order to recognize the internal perfection of an object, it presupposes a concept of what the object is for. So that immediately gets into the understanding and looking at all of its categories and how they apply to the object. And they have to sort through it and see what the object is for. And once we know what it's for, we can see if it's perfect of its own kind. Is it a perfect example of what this type of object is for? And if we're into that, we're not in the beautiful anymore. We're into maybe a philosophical discussion about the purpose of the object, but it can no longer be regarded as purely beautiful. So this idea of beauty as the recognition of the internal perfection of an object, Kant rules out also. The beautiful has nothing to do with the recognition of a concept, and it doesn't have anything to do with the activation of the conceptual faculties of either the reason or the understanding. Judgment hovers somewhere in between them, and it doesn't have anything to do with concepts. And so the apprehension of beauty should not have to do with conceptual contemplation. And I think this is where Kant begins to get onto some shaky ground here, because really, as far as I can tell, the type of beauty that he's talking about here is a very specific type of beauty. Let's say it's the type of beauty represented in an artist like Renoir. If we take Renoir as an impressionist, of all the impressionists, he's the most shallow and superficial. This is why old ladies like him. There's nothing challenging in him. He's not a provocateur the way Manet was. And he's a sort of, it's just a pure Epicurean apprehension of beautiful trees and people on a boat party and carousing in a restaurant. It's very superficial and just has to do with the play of light. It's exactly what Kant says here is the apprehension of the beautiful. But if we talk about an artist like Manet, the guy who founded the whole Impressionist development, Manet was a displaced philosopher, a displaced kind of social critic who was applying Baudelairean critical principles of the modern. Baudelaire invented the modern, and Manet was more or less, Baudelaire was the prophet of Impressionism insofar as he said that the modern painter ought to paint the themes of the city, not old archaic myth stories and anecdotes and allegories and historical episodes, but ought to represent the city, especially the new reborn Paris under Haussmann and Napoleon III under the Second Empire, a reborn city, and the flaneur, the crowd, and the phenomena of the city, the stroller. And so you always have this taking up in Impressionist art of the stroller's point of view, the flaneur walking down the streets of the city. But in Manet, all of his paintings are conceptual paintings. And if you try to look at something like Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe, There's some ideas going on there, and it's not just an apprehension of the beautiful the way Monet and Renoir are. Manet was a social critic, and he's got ideas worked out in all of his paintings. There's a profundity in them. The painting that he painted, for example, The Railway, which shows his mistress reading in a book, and she looks like she's just been interrupted, and her daughter, or whoever it is beside her, a young girl who's turning the other way and looking at the railway station through bars that look like a prison, suggests that she is looking into the future, and the future is the iron cage of the prison of technology, symbolized by the railway that is going to encase that girl in the future. She's going to become, as we all have now, a prisoner of a technological world from which there will be no escape save via the age of catastrophe, which we're in now, where it will all melt down. But you can see these ideas in Manet, and there are concepts in art, plenty of them, especially once you get into contemporary art and you're looking at a figure like Joseph Beuys, for whom there is no way to understand any of his works of art without understanding the concepts that each work of art embodies. His fat chair, for example, has nothing to do with the apprehension of a beautiful object or even a sublime object. It has to do with a philosophical idea incarnated in a tangible form. And so I think that Kant's discussion of the beautiful here is very naive and short-sighted, and is a very one-dimensional way of approaching art. He's only really talking about one type of art, and it's a very naive type in that, even as far as that goes. And then he talks about how there are two different kinds of beauty, free beauty and dependent beauty, and how free beauty has to do with the representation of beauty, pure and simple, without any kind of conceptual or sensory admixture. It might be the representation of beautiful seashells, or kinds of music with no words, or fantasias, which are music with no themes. In other words, everything is devoid of concepts. It's just pure sensory beauty. Whereas dependent beauty or adherent beauty always involves a certain amount of purposiveness mixed in with it. For example, the representation of a beautiful church. You have to know what the church is for in order to see it as a beautiful example of its kind. So there's an admixture there, so it's never entirely pure. And he recognizes that very often the beautiful may not be an entirely pure type of aesthetic phenomenon. And then he finishes the discussion for relation when he talks about the ideal of beauty. And as he talked about in the Critique of Pure Reason, the ideal of beauty, the ideal of something, is the incarnation in human form, or the personification in human form of one of the ideas of the reason. And in the Critique of Pure Reason, he had said that there were only three types, or three ideas: God, freedom, and immortality. But it's clear that in this book, he's adding a fourth idea, namely the ideal of beauty, which is not something that we can ever see. It's only produced by the imagination. And he makes a distinction within it with regard to what he calls the normal beauty, on the one hand, versus the rational idea. The normal idea versus the rational idea. The normal idea of beauty is beauty as a norm, which upholds a certain ideal for a particular human race. The Negro ideal of beauty, as he says here, is going to be different from the Chinaman's ideal of human beauty, which is going to be different from the Greek ideal of human being. They each have a normal idea of beauty that incarnates a particular standard. Same thing with animals. There are ideals. There's a normal idea, a normative idea, what we would call a standard for beauty in nature amongst these specific animals. And it's as though it were the species ideal that is incarnated in the individual particular examples, which never fully incarnate the idea. They only approximate it. And it's something that can only be held in the mind, Kant says, and it's a manifestation of the ideal of beauty. And the ideal of beauty, though, in the human world, has an admixture of the moral dimension to it. Morality is bound up along with this ideal of beauty in the apprehension of the beautiful form. So the ideal of beauty here is a fourth idea of the reason that Kant now adds to the three ideas of God, freedom, and immortality. And then finally he concludes the chapter with the fourth category, the category of modality. Modality, as we recall, has to do with possibility, actuality, and necessity. And here he says that the aesthetic emotion, or rather the judgments of taste, as he puts it, not the emotion, the judgments of taste are a necessary satisfaction insofar as when I say that this thing is beautiful, it ought to be the case that everyone else should also find it beautiful, because it's a necessary beauty. It's a subjective necessity that aspires to objectivity, and it's based on the presupposition of a common sense, that there is a common sense which the human species possesses, such that anyone who has common sense will recognize the objective judgment of taste that I make when I say that a painting by Renoir or a statue by Myron is beautiful. And so there's a kind of a necessariness, a necessity of satisfaction about it in that example. So that's the four categories as of the aesthetical judgments.